I've always loved hiking alone. Being in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and fresh air, has always been my way to disconnect and recharge. But after what happened last spring, I've promised myself I'll never camp alone again. It started with a plan for a solo weekend camping trip in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest. I chose a trailhead about 3 hours from home, one I'd hiked a few times before but never explored deeply. It was one of those places where cell service cuts out miles before you even get to the parking lot, perfect for some peace and quiet. I arrived mid-morning, and my car was the only one in the lot. That didn't surprise me. It was off-season, and this area wasn't exactly well known. Still, the complete emptiness gave me pause. There's something about being the only person in a place like that. It's liberating but unnerving at the same time. I grabbed my pack, locked up the car, and started down the trail. About 20 minutes in, I saw something that made me stop. A man was standing off to the side of the trail, about 50 feet into the trees. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing away from me. He wasn't dressed for hiking. He had on jeans and a dark hoodie, and his posture was stiff, unnatural. I felt a prickle of unease, but told myself maybe he was a hunter or just someone out for a walk. I called out, "Hey there!" He didn't respond. I hesitated, waiting for him to turn or acknowledge me, but he stayed perfectly still. The woods around us were eerily silent, no wind, no birds. Finally, I just kept walking, picking up my pace. I didn't look back. About an hour later, I reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp. It was a beautiful spot, near a creek, with plenty of space for my tent. I tried to shake off the weird encounter and focus on enjoying the trip. By evening, I'd set up camp, cooked some dinner, and settled in by the fire with a book. As the sun dipped below the trees, the familiar sounds of the forest came alive. Crickets, the babble of the creek, the occasional rustle of leaves. But just as I was starting to relax, I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, blending with the ambient noise, but they grew louder. Slow, deliberate crunches of someone moving through the underbrush. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound. The beam illuminated the tree line, but I didn't see anything. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. The footsteps stopped, and I stood there, flashlight shaking in my hand, scanning the trees. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was just an animal and went back to the fire. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I woke up to the sound of something brushing against my tent. Not a rustle or a gust of wind. Something deliberate, like a hand dragging along the fabric. I froze, holding my breath. My knife was under my sleeping bag and my bear spray was just outside the tent flap. I stayed completely still, straining to hear, and then I heard it. Footsteps circling the tent. They weren't fast or panicked. They were measured, slow, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. I worked up the courage to unzip the tent just enough to look out. The fire had died down to embers, and the clearing was dark. But in the faint light, I saw him. It was the man from the trail, standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a tree. He wasn't moving, just watching. I shouted, "Who are you? What do you want?" He didn't answer. He just stood there. I grabbed the bear spray, stepped out of the tent, and aimed it toward him. "Get out of here," I yelled, my voice shaking. He didn't flinch. Instead, he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the fire with my knife and bear spray in hand, my back against a tree. At first light, I packed up and started hiking back to my car. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced he was following me, but I never saw him again. When I reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there, just like before. That didn't make sense. If he was out here, where was his car? I threw my gear into the trunk and climbed in, locking the doors. As I started the engine, I noticed something on the windshield. A single muddy handprint, smeared across the glass. I don't know how long he was out there or what he wanted, but the thought of him watching me, following me, makes my skin crawl to this day. I haven't been back to that trail since, and I don't think I ever will. I've been working as a park ranger for nearly 10 years. It's a job I love. Being outdoors, protecting the wilderness, helping people enjoy nature. But there's one case I was involved in that still haunts me, even years later. It happened in the fall of 2016. The park where I worked is massive, covering hundreds of square miles of dense forest, mountains, and remote trails. We get a lot of campers, especially during the cooler months. And while most of the calls we get are for minor things, lost hikers, twisted ankles, this one was different. A man named Eric had checked in with the park office 2 days earlier. He was an experienced solo camper and had planned to hike a specific trail and camp near a remote lake about 10 miles from the main road. He left behind a detailed itinerary, something we always recommend, but he never came back. When his family didn't hear from him, they called us. At first, I assumed it was a routine delay. Maybe he lost track of time or decided to stay an extra night. It happens. But when we reached the trailhead, something felt off immediately. Eric's car was still parked in the lot, covered in a thin layer of dirt and leaves, like it had been sitting there for a while. His camping permit was visible on the dashboard, but here's what stuck out. There were footprints around the car. Not unusual in itself, but they weren't just his. There were multiple sets of footprints in the dirt, some leading to the driver's side, and some around the back of the car. It looked like someone had been walking around it recently, but Eric was supposed to be miles deep into the woods. We started down the trail, following his itinerary. It was a crisp, clear morning, and the forest was quiet, almost too quiet. About 3 miles in, we found something strange. A small pile of rocks stacked neatly on the side of the trail. It wasn't unusual to see cairns marking trails, but this one didn't look like a marker. It looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. We didn't think much of it and kept moving, but an hour later we found another one, and then another. Each one was closer to the center of the trail, as if whoever made them wanted to make sure we saw them. By mid-afternoon, we reached the area where Eric was supposed to camp. The site was empty, but it was clear someone had been there recently. The fire pit was cold but intact, and there were footprints in the soft dirt near the lake. And then we found the tent. It was pitched a little ways off the main trail, half hidden by trees. At first I was relieved, thinking we'd finally caught up to him. But as we got closer, I noticed something was wrong. The tent was slashed. Not torn like an animal had gotten into it. Slashed, deliberately, with clean cuts down the sides. Inside, his gear was scattered everywhere, like someone had gone through it in a hurry. His backpack was still there, along with his sleeping bag and cooking supplies, but there was no sign of Eric. We radioed for backup, and a search team was sent out immediately. As night fell, we set up camp near the lake. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. That night, as I sat by the fire, I noticed something about the footprints we'd been seeing all day. They weren't all Eric's. Some of them were larger, like they belonged to a bigger man wearing boots. And they weren't just near the tent. They circled it, over and over. I barely slept that night. Every noise, every crack of a branch, every rustle in the bushes set me on edge. The next morning we resumed the search. We followed the trail farther into the woods, hoping to find some sign of Eric. About a mile from the campsite, we found something that made my stomach turn. It was his phone. It was lying on the trail, face down, the screen cracked but still intact. There was no way he'd just drop it and keep walking. We turned it on, hoping it might give us some clues, but the battery was dead. As the day wore on, the weather started to turn. Clouds rolled in and the wind picked up, making it harder to hear or see anything. That's when we found the last clue, a single boot, half buried in the mud near a shallow creek. It was Eric's size, and it looked like it had been there for at least a day. But there were no other footprints nearby, no sign of a struggle, no trail to follow, just the boot, sitting there like it had been left on purpose. After 5 days, the official search was called off. Eric was declared missing, presumed dead. But here's the part that still gives me chills. 2 weeks after the search ended, one of my colleagues went back to the area where we found the tent. He found a new pile of rocks. It was stacked neatly in the middle of the trail, directly in front of the campsite, and sitting on top of the pile was Eric's wallet. The cash and cards were still inside, untouched. To this day, no one knows what happened to Eric. Some people think he got lost and succumbed to the elements. Others think he was attacked by an animal. But me, I think someone else was out there, someone who didn't want him or us there. And whoever it was, they're still out there watching. I work as a fire lookout in a remote part of Idaho. It's not the kind of job you take if you're looking for excitement. Most of the time, it's just me, the forest, and the endless horizon. It's peaceful, sure, but it can also get lonely. And then, there are moments that remind you why most people don't stick around. This happened during my second season on the job. It was mid-September, and the weather had started to turn crisp, the kind of cool air that carries sound farther than usual. I was stationed at a tower about 12 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a long, winding trail. It was the most isolated post in the entire system, but that's what I loved about it. One evening, I was wrapping up my nightly routine, checking for any signs of fire, logging weather conditions, and making sure the radio was charged. The sun had just set, painting the sky a deep orange, and the forest below was cloaked in shadow. I stepped out onto the catwalk to enjoy the view when I saw it. A light. It was faint, but unmistakable, flickering through the trees about a mile away. At first I thought it might be another lookout, or maybe a group of late-season campers. But I knew the area well, and there were no trails or campsites in that direction. The light didn't move like a flashlight or a lantern. It stayed in one place, bobbing slightly, like someone was standing there, holding it. I tried to radio it in, but all I got was static. It wasn't unusual. This far out, the reception was hit or miss, but it added to my unease. I decided to keep an eye on it and see if it moved. For nearly an hour, the light stayed where it was, flickering occasionally. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it went out. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe it was just a lost hiker or someone passing through. The next morning, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my pack, binoculars, and a handheld radio and headed down the trail. The forest was quiet. The only sounds the crunch of leaves under my boots and the distant call of birds. It took me about an hour to reach the spot where I'd seen the light. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, just trees and undergrowth. But as I looked closer, I saw it. A small makeshift camp. There was no tent, just a circle of rocks for a fire pit, long since cold. Nearby, I found a pile of sticks and branches arranged in a strange, deliberate pattern, almost like a crude symbol. And then there was the smell. It was faint, but unmistakable, like rotting meat. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No answer. I stayed for a few more minutes, looking around for any sign of who might have been there. There was no trash, no footprints, no signs of recent activity. Just that awful smell and the eerie stillness of the forest. As I started back to the tower, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, but the trail behind me was always empty. That night, as I sat in the tower logging my findings, I noticed something strange. The light was back, but this time it was closer, less than half a mile away. I stared at it through my binoculars, my heart pounding. The light was steady now, brighter than before, and I could see a faint figure standing next to it. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the tower. I tried the radio again, but all I got was static. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the light, hoping to get their attention, but they didn't react. They just stood there. I stayed inside the tower that night, my rifle within arm's reach. By morning, the light was gone, but my nerves were shot. I decided to report the incident to my supervisor when I radioed in my morning check-in. But when I told him about the light in the camp, his response chilled me. "That's not the first time someone's reported seeing something like that," he said. "There have been a few other sightings in that area over the years. No one's ever gotten a good look, but it's probably best if you stay out of that part of the forest." I didn't ask any more questions. For the rest of my shift, I kept my focus on my work and avoided looking too long at the tree line. I wanted to believe it was just a drifter or a camper, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. My season ended a few weeks later, and I haven't gone back to that post since. Sometimes when I think about it, I wonder if I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a coincidence, just my imagination running wild. But then I remember the smell at the camp, and the way that figure stood there watching. Whatever or whoever it was, they wanted me to see them, and that's what scares me the most.